Hi all, I have another absolutely fascinating game to show you of Hou Yifan. This is against Elina Danielian in the third Women's Grand Prix 2010. Let's have a look. Knight f3, we have knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, d5, d4, so we're transposing into a Queen's Gambit. Declines, but the Ragozin variation, the pin bishop b4. We have c takes, e takes, queen a4 check. So trying to disrupt black by putting the knight in front of the pawn. Here, this is a very popular move, queen a4 check. You might think it breaks some sort of beginner's rule about moving the queen too early in the opening. But it has this idea that if black can't really play c5 to hit at white centre is kind of more solid in some respects. That d4 pawn is going to be there quite in a more solid manner. So we have bishop g5, h6. Now, if bishop h4, there might be some interesting play for black involving g5 at some point and knight e4, maybe even immediately. So white actually has the intention to take on f6. So this gives the bishop without the counterpart. This bishop without the counterpart, could black generate play on dark squares later? And black doesn't really have to give up this bishop on c3 necessarily. We see e3, black castles, bishop e2, bishop e6, so this supports d5, so it won't be hanging if white unpins that knight to knight takes d5. So white does unpin the knight. And now here this gets really interesting. Can this bishop be actually preserved? If it goes back immediately, bishop d6, this didn't happen. There is knight b5 here. And it will be a shame here if the bishop moves, then there's knight takes c7. If the bishop has to give itself up, well, it's an interesting game, but it looks as though black hasn't got that much counterplay or interesting imbalances here. So it is an interesting imbalance to kind of preserve if the bishop wants to go to d6. Going to e7 is also potentially fraught with danger actually. Queen b5, for example, hits b7 and d5. We have here instead a precautionary move, a6, so stopping the use of b5 from white. Rook fc1, and now bishop d6, so that's done in safety without any knight b5. So black has succeeded in preserving an important asset, the dark square bishop without a counterpart. But without the traditional c5 counterplay, can black actually arrange a kind of decontainment strategy to activate the pieces somehow, to create some entry points into white's position if the centre is so secure here? It looks as though this is in some respects pretty solid from white. We have queen d1. There's a really interesting, very, very high level stem game in this position between Levon Aronian and Vichy Anand, who's also a Ragozin major exponent. And that actually went a3. It's very interesting. a6 has a subtle downside that if a piece ends up, especially a knight, ends up on c5, which is a very, very logical outpost square on this semi-open file, then maybe white can use that to play for e4. And there was this high-level game, Levon Aronian against Anand Baden-Baden 2015, saw this continuation where Levon Aronian parked his queen on b2. Black played very aggressively, it seems, over this side of the board. But once a knight was established on c5, and you can see it's difficult to kick, white actually then solidified the dark squares against the blast of the bishop. Vichy tried to get an attack, and white, pretty solid though, played for e4. And this actually shows some of the downsides, that even if black has the dark square bishop and it had to be given up, then white actually emerged with a great position in the end. Black just had quite a few weaknesses, unfortunately, and had to resign here. So that shows that sometimes, perhaps with using the c5 square, white can be absolutely fine. But in this game, queen d1, and white doesn't seem to be that quick to be using that kind of plan for c5. So what happened here? Rook ad8, rook ab1. Here, Now, if instead knight a4, that's interesting to try and use the c5 square like the major stem game. For example, this white would have an edge, so that's actually quite interesting. If rook b8, again, this should be interesting for both sides. It should be that c5 square is good. There's a potential minority attack here. There's chances for both sides, but we have rook ab1. G5, so black is playing energetically, and with this bishop without the counterpart, the dark squares you might think are more vulnerable than usual, but black has to blast some lines open here, especially without that c5 break. Black has to sort of try and open up in some other way. So we have queen g7, which is a key move. It unleashes the power of the f pawn, which might in turn mean f4, which might in turn mean weakening white on the dark squares, so this bishop can really relish the dark square play potentially. If g4 is also possible straight away, it seems like this is another way of playing it very aggressively, where black could generate some play with the g3 break sometimes. So for example like this, okay, the queen side's vulnerable, but look at the dark squares on this side of the board. They can potentially explode like this, with black getting a good position, very good position potentially. This is just an example continuation. So there are ways and means of generating breakthrough attempts. So we have, okay, queen g7 though, knight e7, knight a4. So yes, the knight is going for that c5 square now. Is it a bit slower than the other major Sten game which came later, 5 years later? Knight d2, f4. It seems as though this looks pretty aggressive. Bishop g4, trying to do something with the light square weaknesses. Knight f5. Now here, knight f1 was played. This seems to be a key point where white could have tried giving up the other bishop. This seems ridiculous to give up both bishops. So, black having the bishop pair here. But it seems with e4, white is able to sometimes get a very good position, getting the light square bishop back, and black does seem to be weak on the light squares here. That should be about even, that position. But here we had knight f1, so not taking on f5, b6, knight a4, rook d e8, rook c3, king h8, rook bc1, bishop d7. So the queen's actually tied down to the knight here. Black seems to be pretty solid on the queen side right now. Bishop e2. Okay, looking at a6, but now black plays f takes, and now dangerous battery, queen f6. So with the battery getting some common squares going with that rook reinforcing the queen sometimes if the knight moves. And in fact, white's in a very, very difficult position now. The queen can't move because the bishop takes a4. So the queen can't easily defend e3. So in fact, knight b2 happens. So just to put a few variations on the board, queen d2, bishop takes a4. King h1 is also dangerous, knight h4. For example here, bishop takes a4 again. The queen can't ever move. So bishop takes, unfortunately here, with the dark square bishop and the knight and the queen and the rook like this, you can expect some sort of disaster to happen, like knight takes g2. And this is just a very, very powerful attack now in this variation, with the g file being great for black. If we look at this again after knight takes g2, if bishop d3, knight takes e3, this is also pretty devastating. If king takes g2, queen f2 check, bishop h3, bishop g2 is mate. So these lines are all pretty lethal actually. So knight b2 was played. And can you guess what black plays in this position if I give you 5 seconds to pause the video? Okay, so the culmination of getting extreme counterplay through queen g7, f5, f4 has culminated in this tactic now, knight takes e3. So white is painfully weak on the dark squares. We have knight takes e3. It doesn't matter about rook takes, there's still the same consequence. Queen's got access to f2 here, so queen f2 check, and now taking on e3, rook takes, queen c2, rook f2. This is really dangerous. Knight d1, queen f4, threatening checkmate, and the game ended here. yes, you might wonder, okay, what exactly happens here? If white had to resign, so if g3, there's rook takes h2, queen takes g3, and mate. If king g1, can you guess? 5 seconds. Okay, rook takes g2 is strongest, queen takes, and this is mating after check. That's checkmate. And if king f1, then there's check here, check on h4, and bishop f4, queen g3, the king's not running away that easily, and gets mated there. And in that line, if king g2, then queen g3 and bishop h3. So yeah, it's all pretty devastating here. So yes, it's white has to resign there. And yeah, as we saw, that's the main critical line as well. So white didn't bother after queen f4. That was it. So yeah, an amazing Ragozin game. There are really some stunning examples by Hou Yifan. But if you want to check out other notable and model games, there's an amazing Ragozin course. If you check out that Kingscrusher TV link /Ragozin with a lot of trainable variations. It's a free course, short and sweet series at Chessable, so well worth checking out if you want to sharpen your Ragozin variation. So this interesting game shows that sometimes black has the dark square bishop, not giving it up without the counterpart, and how to drum up counterplay on the king side was shown in this particular example. Okay, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much.